Okay, very good morning to everybody. Thank you so much for joining our July webinar series on reading programs in fragile states. Today we're very happy to have two speakers with us. We have Susan Ayari. Susan Ayari is a creative associate. She's a senior international educator with over 30 years of teaching experience in Tunisia and 10 years of experience working with education in Yemen and Jordan. She has specific expertise in teaching early grade literacy and numeracy and in developing and implementing interactive curriculum. Before joining Creative, Ms. Ayari served as Chief of Education in the UNICEF Country Office in Jordan. Prior to this position, she was a Director of Education for the United States, USAID, United States Agency for International Development in Jordan, and held senior positions at USAID in Yemen. Her technical areas of specialization include strategy development, education planning and implementation, education programming, formal primary, secondary education, and data analysis and educational decision-making and reporting. In her work, Ms. Ayari managed programs across sectors and agencies, supervised teams of education specialists, and developed USAID's education strategy in Yemen and Jordan. She has managed numerous major project portfolios both at UNICEF and at USAID, and has extensive knowledge of USAID policies and procedures. Earlier in her career, she taught at the American Cooperative School in Tunis, and during her tenure, won the International School Service Innovative Practice Award. She holds an MA from Boston State College and a BA from Boston University in Elementary Education. Welcome, Susan. Our second speaker, who's the discussant for our panel today, is Margaret Sinclair. Margaret Sinclair is an education planner who has worked on education in emergencies since 1987. An independent consultant, she worked from 2009 to 2017 as technical advisor at Education Above All, EAA. As part of EAA's Protect Education in Insecurity and Conflict program. Her work included developing collaboration with UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning on conflict-sensitive planning and curriculum. She is an advocate of education for learning to live together and for the related Sustainable Development Goal Target 4.7. She worked earlier with UNESCO, including support for the establishment of the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, INEE. And she was previously head of education for the UN Refugee Agency. In 2016, she was awarded an honorary doctorate at the University of Sussex for her contribution to education in emergencies. Welcome, Margaret. So without further ado, I'll let Susan go ahead and start the panel presentation. If you have any questions, I'd like you to either type them in the chat box or in the discussion area. I'll put a note in there so you can put your questions in there. And at the end of the presentations, we'll take the questions from the participants. Please go ahead, Susan.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Today's a propitious day. It's my 1-year anniversary at Creative, so I can't think of a better way of celebrating that than by being here with you all today. So today's presentation is on implementing reading programs in fragile states, how to make it work even if you're not quite sure what tomorrow will bring. So in today's presentation, I will cover the design phases of early grade reading programs, knowing your context, the broad program design, specific implementation and activity design, look at challenges and how those challenges open up opportunities, needs for further investigations, and key takeaways from the work that we've done in fragile contexts. So how to make it work in fragile states. Using the education and fragility framework provides a foundation for asking critical questions at the time of program design to ensure implementation responds to the context and the drivers of fragility. This is useful at the time of proposal development and then can be re-verified at the time of implementation. And this framework was developed by USAID and then revisited by Yolande Millegranvaux in 2009. So USA does emphasize in RFPs and RFAs for programming in fragile states that the implementer knows the context by doing a rapid education risk analysis, that collaboration, learning, and adaptation are built into the implementation approach to ensure that the key players and people are brought into a very collaborative process for implementation, and this also ensures adaptability, particularly in environments that are fluid and fast-moving. And finally, to build research and evidence building into programming to build our body of knowledge of implementing reading programs in fragile contexts. At the same time, there are expectations from the clients to have a broad analysis, such as USAID's WERA or the Global Education Cluster's Education Needs Assessment. In many contexts, these environments are already saturated with broad-based analysis. USAID isn't the only organization that does them. UNESCO, World Bank, UNICEF. People come on the ground, they want to know what the context is. And oftentimes, there's pushback from national governments or from ministries of education who believe that there's been enough of these broad analysis, that the information is out there for implementers to procure, but what's more importantly needed are very specific research and data collecting assessments in order to impact and inform implementation. Specifically, in the case of Yemen, in Afghanistan, there was a need to do a language mapping. That would be true really in any environment. You would want to know what the home languages are versus language of instruction, where the various language pockets are in relationship to the school community. A cluster survey, so you can see how the schools are clustered together. If they're also integrating in working with non-formal education centers or community-based education centers, you would want to also see how those clusters fit in so you can maximize your training and your implementation of your activities. A gender assessment is crucial for knowing what the issues are for girls and women in the communities where you work, and an organizational development assessment or OCDA or OCA, it comes with different names, to really have a handle on what the capacity is at the systemic level, where there are gaps, and how those gaps can be addressed. So you need to really know your drivers of fragility, insecurity, and conflict to see how they're related to these systems and what you're going to be working on. This, again, is based on Miller-Granvaux's framework. So in the case of insecurity and violence, this is where protection comes into play. Programs must make every effort to protect those who are threatened and provide psychosocial support to school communities. This picture here, it's not a school, it's a home in an IDP camp in Nigeria, but whether schools are under attack or families in their homes are under attack, the impact is the same. It creates trauma and stress in the community and for the children, and those needs need to be addressed. At the same time, it's necessary to support alternative language services or learning services where formal schools may not be accessible, such as community-based education centers in Afghanistan or non-formal learning centers in northeast Nigeria. There's a need for identification and removal of discriminatory and hate and violence messages in existing materials and avoidance of any such messaging in new materials. And of course, you need to address issues of gender-based violence in programming. These are just some of the things that you need to look at that are outlined in Gronville's framework. Specifically to the delivery of a reading program, you would want to not only work with a Ministry of Education, but really work through the Ministry of Education at all levels. You would want to establish rollout plans based on safe access to communities. You certainly need to strengthen community participation and ownership, and always have contingency plans in place. For the other three main headers as things that you need to look for under this framework, when it comes to corruption, you want to address it in education and really mitigate the potential or real sources of fragility. And that means addressing action on governance issues, such as identifying the scope and impact of corruption within and around an education system, redressing or eliminating inequitable treatment across geographic or identity groups, assuring that the management information systems focus on accountability and transparency of financial management, transparency in the administration of exams and student promotions, and discriminatory or exclusionary practices that determine access and the retention of teachers. Specific to an early grade reading program, you would want to provide capacity to support to government officials so they can effectively carry out their responsibilities. And you want to build the capacity of parent associations so they can advocate for fair practices that support accountability and transparency and allow for community-based support for the programs. When it comes to exclusion, exclusion is often a very powerful trigger for instability, especially in fragile contexts. And oftentimes this response has been to increase demand for and supply for services for all. But if exclusion is a source of the conflict, some other options perhaps might be more viable. One might be to assess the scope and nature of the exclusion, increase access to education for neglected groups and geographic zones in order to mitigate geographic and identity favoritism, provide psychosocial and trauma healing support to victims of war, torture, and rape, and provide education in alternative learning or non-formal centers. Specific to early grade reading, you'd want to provide teachers with skills to work with more inclusive populations, provide training at the school or cluster level to promote participation, especially for females. You want to use the community to learn who is excluded and how to safely include them, particularly if you're looking at students or children with disabilities, and use information gained from a policy review and gap analysis to understand the policy level context for addressing gender, language of instruction, and disabilities, to name a few. And finally, in discussing or thinking about capacity, poor capacity of a state or its institutions to provide education services threatens the stability of the state and the education system as a whole. So when rebuilding capacity, some things you want to consider are thinking outside the box for teacher training. Traditional formal methods may not be the answer. Providing safety and protection measures for teachers and schools, including psychosocial support, social emotional learning, ethics, and professional standards of behavior in teacher training programs. And specific to early grade reading, you'd want to develop workable and cost-effective ICT support, whether for training, coaching, mentoring, or material delivery systems. You want to support planning of out-year budgets when planning with governments for national scale-up. And you need to find champions in the government who support early grade reading programming and use them to promote nationally the importance of early grade reading. Excuse me, I'm trying to, there we go. So, how to make it work when designing the program. As you address the drivers of fragility, as I said prior, you need to really understand your context. Reading programs can be a rallying point, which can serve to unify rather than divide. The real issue is how you build consensus around the curriculum, which is often sensitive and political. In some cases, you need to think about what the regional context is. So in Yemen, for example, a national consensus was built by ensuring that there were representatives from each government of the country where regional issues, north versus south, had to be taken into consideration. The inverse, it was Pakistan, where the curriculum was adapted at the provincial level because the system is decentralized. So provincial contextualization and consensus was critical in the adaptation of the materials in the program. In Afghanistan, religion is a key unifying issue. So the materials that we've developed had to be grounded in Islamic references as proof that they meet social norms and expectations, and these materials were reviewed by a religious committee as well. And then if you're working with multiple ethnic groups, like we've seen in our work in Nigeria, but which is true in many countries in Africa, you want your representation of culture through mother tongue instruction and also materials that are culturally relevant. When you decide on or define the support that is most needed to be effective, this is where the organizational capacity development assessment and plan is critical. So a policy gap analysis and capacity needs provide the process by which a Ministry of Education can prioritize the technical assistance needed to create an infrastructure for implementing a national program. In the case of Afghanistan, the OCDP has been fully accepted by the ministry as a necessary process to gain the needed system support for a national scale-up, which is now very high visibility in the country. It's been supported by the First Lady of Afghanistan, and this is where having champions in the government can help make a positive difference. If we're looking at opportunities for change that the reading program can promote in these environments, this is where I believe social emotional learning can make a difference. Teachers can be trained on the key aspects of a safe and healthy classrooms and the core skills of social and emotional learning. In Afghanistan, we're using the skills as outlined by IRC, who's our partner there and has done significant research and work in the area of social emotional learning. Those skill areas are brain building, emotional regulation, positive social skills, conflict resolution skills, and perseverance. SEL can be infused into the reading program through classroom management, teaching methods, activities, and reading passages. And this is what we are now embarking on with Afghanistan's Afghan Children Read program. Okay, let's see. I'm sorry, excuse me. I'm having problems getting, here we are. So how do you make it work at project launch? And I think here what is key is to ensure you bring the right actors on board to your programming. You want to ensure that you've got all the national actors on board who really understand the reading problem in their country and have a way to map improving the reading issues. One way to do that is through the establishment of a steering group at the Ministry of Education, which would be made up of representatives from all critical ministry departments. This allows for interdirectorate conversations. As many of you know, ministries have a tendency to function in a very stovepipe manner. At the same time, I think as implementers, we often err on the side of conservatism in dealing with the higher levels at ministries, and we focus our work on the technical folks who do the direct implementation. And I think it's important to remember to work at both ends. You need to keep decision makers informed through fora and feedback loops while working with, at the technical level, with those who will directly support implementation. In Afghanistan, we've seen sometimes that the country politics get mirrored in the MOE politics, where either tribal affiliation manifests itself in MOE alliances, or where departments themselves take on the attributes of a tribe. So this steering group allows for open conversation and ensuring that all parts of the ministry who need to be informed are kept informed. As part of bringing stakeholders on board, it's important that they see the long-term impacts of what could potentially be large financial investments in early grade primary education. So you want to give the feedback on what research has shown us, that longevity in school is improved when children's reading at the lower grades is improved. We know that if as a result of that longevity, if girls stay in school longer, the longer they stay in school, the greater the chances they will not marry early. They will have healthier children and will support education for their own families, so that impacts education for future generations. And continuing along this, you want to make sure that in fragile contexts that you can expect that the criteria for selection may need to be adjusted or sidelined, either because technical capacity is very low or there are political considerations. We do know that in fragile contexts that you won't find the same kind of capacity at the ministry that you would find in middle-income states where you're implementing. One way we got around this in Afghanistan, particularly in trying to get a strong cohort of master trainers for early grade reading was we had a pool of very strong generalists from the teacher education department and the curriculum department, both with regards to training and language. They weren't experts in literacy acquisition, so we provided that training and technical support to bring them up to speed in this area. And of course, you want to make use of advocates both inside and outside of the Ministry of Education, university professors, artists, writers, because the broader the understanding of EGR programming is, that their understanding is of EGR programming, the greater an advocate they become with the ability to convince others that an investment in a national scale up for improved reading is a worthwhile investment. So how to make it work when designing implementation? I think the first thing to realize is that learning to read is positive social and emotional learning. When children are successful and confident, when they love learning and going to school, teachers are better. They respond to that positive feedback, and kids feel less threatened in school. So we talk a lot about SEL and the need to implement SEL overtly, but I think it's also critical to realize that good reading and learning to read is and contributes to social and emotional well-being. We also need to think about developing materials that are based on the research. So you want to make sure that those who are writing the materials have a strong technical background on literacy acquisition and how to best scope and sequence introduction of letters, writing reading passages, and putting materials together that are effective. And at the same time, you want to make sure the writers are trained in or have a sensitivity to the conflicts that may arise in the local environment, but at the same time realize that not all reading passages have to address conflict or disaster, that the social and emotional learning piece is embedded in how teachers work with the content by seeking students' feelings and opinions, asking critical thinking questions, and using a variety of teaching techniques in their classroom. You want your materials to be contextually relevant, for sure. They should be engaging. The themes need to reflect cultural norms in the read aloud, student book passages, and illustrations. They all need to be founded on the environment in which they're addressing, which I spoke about earlier on in this presentation. And then you want to make sure that the materials are welcomed and embraced by the community and build social cohesion. And one way to do this is through field testing the materials. You not only get the benefit of master trainers having an opportunity to practice and see the materials they were part of developing used in the field, but it's also a way to get local buy-in. If you test the materials in pockets where you think there might be potential resistance, with the Ministry of Education taking the lead, the likelihood of acceptance is greater. This is how we did it in Afghanistan, and we had school management shuras involved, parents, and so when they saw the materials colorful, there's this picture is an example of one of the the book pages, the response of the children to the methods that the trainers were using with them. There was a lot of excitement and positive feedback for this. So how do you make it work when designing your implementation? Certainly you want to impact classroom management and pedagogy. You want to establish classroom routines that are fun and engaging, participatory, and equitable. This links back to SEL, but at the same time, they need to be contextually feasible. So in Northeast Nigeria, singing and dancing are integrated into the learning process. In Afghanistan and Yemen, that wouldn't be culturally appropriate, so clapping and finger snapping are used for word and syllable counting. Arm gestures are used to define vowels heard in the diacritics, and accent marks. So some kinesthetics, but not overdoing the kinesthetics. You want to make sure that parents are engaged in their children's reading journey. They need to understand what the reading program is about and how they can support it, and they should be brought in as early as with the testing of the materials. And even parents who are illiterate can get involved by having their children read to them at home and can see themselves how their children are learning. And then you want your program to provide the opportunity to open up pathways for the professionalization of teaching. And this is where you might look to begin linking with pre-service, where appropriate, working with teacher training colleges, community colleges, or schools of education to begin putting together pre-service programs specifically related to early literacy. So, where does that bring us? So, of course, no program is implemented without challenges, particularly in fragile contexts, but you need to be thinking about how these challenges can be turned into opportunities. I'm citing 3 examples here. I'm sure many of you out there have experienced others, but for the sake of time, I've chosen to talk about these 3. When people are isolated because of insecurity, it's important to think about other solutions that can allow these communities to stay in contact by using locally appropriate technologies. In Northeast Nigeria, we've used WhatsApp to support communities of practice. And in Yemen, Facebook and texting were used to support participant communications. Smartphones and texting can be used also for track and trace of material distribution. You want to be able to sustain teaching capacity by establishing localized coaching and mentoring models. So in Afghanistan, we're using teacher learning circles, and they've been aligned with and matched to the curriculum. And in Nigeria, we're using technology to link mentors with teachers. At the same time, there are issues of politics that can get in the way of national assessments. What we saw in Afghanistan was language was a source of tension that we needed to neutralize. With the national survey, which took place all at the same time in both Dari and Pashto, there was kind of a competition, if you like, between regions in the hopes that their region or language area would do better than the other, and this then leads to questions about inter-rater reliability. So what we've done in Afghanistan with our baseline survey is to separate out different times of the year these two baselines to ensure that the implementation and the collection of data do not overlap, as to avoid this kind of tension. For further investigation, there are pre-existing models in the countries where we work that have proven successful in teaching children how to read. I should say pre-existing local models. And often we go into these environments with an assumption that, oh, well, it's an environment under stress, it's a fragile situation, we will bring the models to the context. What we've seen in Nigeria and Afghanistan and Yemen is that children who study in Quranic schools in addition or in lieu of studying in private schools or public schools, that they often do significantly better on the EGRA than those who have only attended public schools. So this is an area that should certainly be further understood and researched. Coaching and mentoring is an area which certainly needs further research. And we need to find locally appropriate and accessible and scalable technologies to ensure that what we're doing to strengthen the delivery of early grade reading programs is in fact sustainable. No one model has come to the fore as a panacea for coaching and mentoring, and there are huge cost implications because it's labor intensive and it requires transporting people around in environments where perhaps the Ministry of Education doesn't have the mobility to do so or the funds to do so. So looking for viable ICT solutions can ensure communication and connect people in isolation. So this should be explored further. The research on the impact of social emotional learning in fragile contexts is very thin. IRC has been doing a great deal of work in this area, and Creative and IRC have several partnerships in Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, but this is a wide open field. Our logic tells us that a child is unburdened by his or her troubles, they can more readily learn and therefore succeed. My 30 years in the classroom certainly demonstrated that for me. When I would watch my students walk into a classroom, I could tell just from their body language which children maybe didn't have such a good morning and needed a little extra support. 30 years of my own experience does not stand as research, however, and so this is an area that can certainly benefit from further elucidation. And also, there haven't been any tools specifically adapted for use in fragile context in relation to social and emotional learning. And this is an area, again, that IRC has been investing time with the hopes of using their work in Northeast Nigeria to validate an adapted tool which could then be contextualized for other fragile contexts. And finally, some key takeaways on working in fragile states. The first is diplomacy matters. In environments which are fluid, where it's not always possible to meet deadlines, but where meeting deadlines is critical, diplomacy will take you far. It demonstrates your willingness to listen to your national counterparts, to bend when it is possible and to push back when it is necessary to do so. In Afghanistan, when the Ministry of Education asked that we develop only 1 year of materials instead of 3 in the first year, we listened to their concerns. We did push back. We had got an agreement to do 2 years worth of materials. And again, when we were under very tight timeline for getting our grades 1 and 2 materials printed and delivered to schools, the ministry came back and asked to have a second review of our reading passages. They felt they needed further life added into them. They were too mechanical, and we were able to accommodate this request by dividing the work of the materials into 2 volumes. This has done significant work. It's benefited us significantly in terms of our relationship with the ministry because, again, as I said, it demonstrates that we know how to listen, we understand their concerns, and so we're confident when we need their support, they will listen to us and provide it in the same way. In fragile contexts where it may not always be easy to demonstrate equity and transparency and meritocracy, we certainly need to attempt to do that and do that in all circumstances. Always working toward the highest common denominator with a realistic view of how things work and a recognition that because of capacity of folks in fragile contexts that there might be some compromises needed. You should ensure that there are strong feedback loop mechanisms at all levels of implementation, and this is where using the collaborative learning adaptation approach is critical. And this provides an opportunity to strengthen your diplomacy and ensure that where there are concerns, the concerns can get voiced, looped back to the people who need to know, and unblock roadblocks or make those concerns less critical in doing so. You want to ensure your situation analysis is tailored to the context. If you find that a broad analysis is not what's needed, but it is something that you are contractually obligated to do, you might limit what that analysis looks like to simply doing a very strong literature review and then move directly into the very specific analyses that you need to do. You always want to have a plan B and even a plan C, because in these environments things can change quickly. We're finding this now in Afghanistan, where we were getting set to implement in one district, and are finding that because of security reasons, we need to limit our implementation in that particular district and add some in that province rather, and open up districts in another province. And also I come back to social and emotional learning. It does matter. You may not be able to provide explicit social and emotional learning courses, but good classroom pedagogy and management should incorporate SEL. SEL promotes social cohesion. It provides a holistic and comprehensive approach to making classrooms safe learning spaces, not only for the children, but for the teachers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was a great presentation. We're going to move on to the discussant now. Margaret?
Okay, yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Susan. That gave us a lot to think about. So, summarizing, you stressed the importance of context, tact, and flexibility. So I'm really representing the education in emergencies community today. And I would like to, from that perspective, confirm the importance of context, because the wide range of circumstances in which you find humanitarian and emergency education, from acute crisis with kids who've just been, in a war situation, right to chronic crises, and through to post-conflict situations when the government is willing to do reforms, but it may or may not have security and so on. There's a very wide range of contexts. There's the language issue, diversity of language. There's the literacy issue, whether you're dealing with parents who are literate or not literate, and so on. So time short, I'll move on to say, if you're in a country and there is a crisis or emergency, the people who are handling education in a humanitarian situation, they may not know much about early grade reading. So a plea that both at the international level and the country level, we try and bring together the education in emergencies types and the early grade reading types to ensure that the kids benefiting from education in crisis projects do have access to the early grade reading materials and the expertise and so on that can help them learn, because it's a caricature, but education in a crisis situation can be seen as getting the children sitting in rows at desks and having somebody take a photograph, and much less expertise goes into the issue of what they're learning, what have they got to read if they're in the lower grades, especially are they actually learning to read. So bringing together the education in emergencies community and the early grade reading community, I myself have come into this field in the last year, and I go to these meetings with early grade reading people, and I find that it really strains my brain to be in, it's like in a foreign country. So I'm picking it up, but a lot of people who work in crisis situations are actually sociologists or economists, or there's all sorts of people who don't happen to know much about early grade reading. Regarding teacher training, another problem that comes up in crisis situations, that often different projects are developing teacher training and they're doing it separately. It's not coordinated. So after the project finishes, it all gets kind of dissipated, whereas ideally the teacher training for early grade reading or other issues from international projects, it should be coordinated and structured along with the ministry so that it builds up to qualifications for the individual teachers and to a known competence in the national teaching force. So if you're working at country level, please try to bring in the education cluster, bring to the education cluster or the local education group and so on this issue of sharing and coordinating in the field of early grade reading. And internationally, let's get the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, the new Education Cannot Wait Fund, and even the Global Digital Repository for Reading Materials and so on to think about crisis situations, fragility, and so on, as well as stable situations. Now, time is short, so I just want to say that I'm very much interested in the social and emotional learning side, as Susan knows. And I've looked at the Enabling Writers Guide, which is, I think, a USAID Global Reading Network project to prepare stories for early grade reading. So I should say, preface this, that I've worked in education in emergencies, and I would rather there are no emergencies. So I would like education to contribute to the prevention of conflict and crisis and easing of fragility. We can't start too young. So with the early grade reading, it does say, for example, positive representation of both genders, positive representation of different ethnic or religious groups. But I would like to go a little further and look at the actual skills for the social and emotional skills, life skills that you can teach at the very young age, and can we build those into stories? So to cut a long story short, I'm trying to encourage you to train the writers of education materials in skills with examples that they can contextualize, so that we get the maximum value through the early grade reading, which is already budgeted for, to support prevention of conflict. And in that regard, I do want to just mention a technical point in case you're interested, and if you are, please try and get in touch with me, that the impact for social and emotional learning, it's stronger if there is if it's explicit, and you have an explicit stimulus activity such as the story, but can we have the teacher reading aloud the story and discussing it, and then the kids reading a simplified version of the story or reading the story afterwards, so that you get the whole class emotionally engaged in the story with some guidance and facilitation from the teacher, rather than just thinking of reading materials as individualized or small group, and then the discussion that would give the social and emotional impact is lessened. So just as an example, I'm in discussion with enabling writers. So a story which incorporates emotional awareness, and as an example, just obviously not contextualized, the Jack and Jill going up the hill, and happy, unhappy when they have to go and do this chore, happy to do it together, and unhappy when they fall down. So this is sort of idea that helps emphasize the emotional awareness in this case, that skill, but then the writers would contextualize emotional awareness in an appropriate way for the culture. So I won't say more right now because time is very short, but I will just ask a question of Susan, that how can we generate, how can a project work towards culturally contextualized, SEL-focused stories, especially if you don't know the language of the instruction? How can you monitor the writing and the piloting? And the second question, more generally, is about scaling up of early grade reading, and how is that possible when the teachers need a lot of training and support and the country is big and very fragile? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Susan, you can go ahead and answer those two questions. And if anyone else has questions from the participants, if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box and I'll relay them to either Margaret or Susan. Thank you.
Okay, so the issue of providing the technical quality into materials when you don't speak the language really has to be handled through interpreters and translators, unfortunately. So our technical experts working with the Ministry of Education in Afghanistan are not Dari and Pashto speakers. They are Arabic and Dutch speakers, and of course English speakers. So the training of these writers has taken place in English with translation, and but those technical folks are there while the materials are being written, and the communication has been very effective. When there are questions that come up as the materials are being translated as quickly as possible, and our technical folks can see where there might be something that needs clarification, that gets sorted out. So the process that we use, which is called a rapid production model, always allows for a feedback loop and looks at the process of the writing. So in between every stage of the material development, there is an opportunity to reflect, ask questions, clarify before moving on to the next phase. So that's a method or an approach that creatives using in Afghanistan, and I believe we use the same approach in Yemen, that has proven to be quite successful. And your second question was about scaling up, I believe, and teacher training, and also costs of scaling up. And you're right, this is critical in environments where already you know, just the allocation of funds for education is never enough. What we have done, again, in using Afghanistan as an example, is build a very, very strong cohort of trainers, master trainers at the central level, and with the expectation that they then and now have the skills to roll this training out at a national scale. So right now, without our experts in country, those expert master trainers from the Central Afghanistan Ministry are in the process of doing a training of teachers training in Nangarhar. We believe that their skills are exactly what is needed for this kind of a scale up. So you need to really build the capacity at the central level, at the structural level, so that these kinds of efforts can be rolled out.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm trying to see if there are any questions. There was one comment from Lisa Detters from USAID. She said they also have the Rapid Education Risk Analysis Guide when examining drivers of fragility, insecurity, and conflict. Information on this is, she's provided a link, and we'll provide that link on the blog for this webinar, and it'll be posted on our website. I don't know if either of you had a comment on this.
Yes, I'm aware of the guide, and I believe the RERA guidance has gone through, I'm assuming it's the second iteration. It still becomes an issue, I think, in environments where there's some pushback, because it is a very broad analysis that was originally designed for missions to do, not for implementers, so that it would inform missions on the best kind of designs or RFAs they should develop given their context. It's now become something that is expected from implementers or by implementers to do, and it's a contractual obligation, and that's where, you know, sometimes the difficulty is in with the timing. You know, if you're given 30 days or 90 days within which to do something, and you're just trying to establish your trust with your local partner agency, ministry, this can create some strains. So then you have to look at ways to do it that can be accepted by everyone, which is why I said sometimes it might get reduced to simply being a literature review.
Okay, that makes sense. Margaret, did you want to add to this?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. There's another question from Samantha. She wants to know, can either of you say more about neutralizing tensions over language politics?
Well, I'll just say that it's not really an answer, but some work we did in Uganda, for the early grades, we produced world charts which could be discussed in any language, and thereby avoided this is about social and emotional learning, peace, and disaster risk reduction. And by using charts, it avoided the whole language, dilemma.
Well, I think language tensions also can be exacerbated in areas where the language of instruction is not the mother tongue. And we certainly have been shown by research that learning to read in your mother tongue has enormous benefits than learning language in a second language. You know, learning to read in a language that's a second language, or maybe you're learning the language at the same time you're learning to read if your whole life experience has been in with your mother tongue. So some of that is really at a systemic government level, whether it's USAID, that works at that level with governments to come to agreements on language of instruction versus mother tongue instruction, whether and then seeing how the partner can help and support that. But oftentimes these are decisions that go way beyond and above what an implementing partner can satisfy.
Okay, thank you both for your responses. Unfortunately, our time is up for the webinar, but this was a wonderful discussion and presentation by Susan and also discussion by Margaret. We can continue this discussion offline. We will prepare a blog from the Global Reading Network, and it'll be posted on our website with some resources as well as the questions that have been asked during the webinar. But if you have any questions, feel free to email us at our GRN email account, and you can follow up on as well as with Susan and Margaret on any other questions that you have. I also wanted to note that we have another webinar coming up on July 19th, which will be a follow-up to this webinar, and we'll look at more, we'll get more country perspectives on implementing reading in fragile states. So I want to again thank you again, Susan and Margaret, for taking the time today and being on this panel, and thank you to all the participants for participating. I hope everyone has a great day, and we look forward to seeing you on July 19th. Bye-bye.